we're waiting for local feedback. Any homework questions? Other questions?
No, for now. But still not done, so
It's a tough one. This one's gonna be a tough one, I expect.
we'll have to try and finish it today.
Sure.
Hopefully.
You know where to find me if you have any questions. I'll be in the office basically all day today. It's gonna be a super short slide deck, because there's not too much to it. Let's go ahead and get started. So we're gonna talk about simplifying context-free grammars because this is going to be necessary. So first simplification and then talking about normal forms. So what forms are grammars usually in to be able to do something useful with those grammars. I hinted that the big course project was coming as to what that algorithm was. But in order to do that algorithm, we need to talk about how to modify our grammars first. So last we talked about both membership and parsing for context-free grammars. We looked at how infeasible brute force parsing actually was for a couple of different reasons. The efficiency was exponential, which is garbage. And because of this, we need to explore and figure out a more efficient method for figuring this out, because it is a crucial part of writing a compiler. We need to be able to determine whether a program that has been written in a language actually belongs to that language, to determine whether there are any syntax errors in the program. So in general, we have no restrictions on our production construction. We said we could have as long as there is a single non-terminal on the left, there could be any number of terminals and non-terminals on the right-hand side of that production. We did find that we could, in the last slide deck, we could remove any lambdas, as well as make sure that there were, what was the other rule? There was one other rule. It was that we could have within twice as many of the number of steps to the length of the string. If we did this, then we could determine whether it was there or not. So the efficiency was garbage, but if we replaced if we put a couple of restrictions on that production construction, then we would actually be able to determine the membership question, just with garbage efficiency. So the question that we're going to be answering throughout the course of this slide deck mainly, and then diving further into how it's actually done in the next slide deck, can we restrict that right-hand side of a context-free grammar without reducing the power of the grammar, while allowing us to do better than exponential complexity when we want to answer the membership question. So that's what we're going to be exploring. To start, we need to be able to transform the grammar into an equivalent grammar. So we need to make sure that everything that we do creates an equivalent grammar, meaning that it represents the exact same language. So one transformation that we may need to do is to remove the need to consider the empty string if the empty string is accepted. So what can we do to remove the empty string from the right-hand side of a production? We just have one particular rule. Here's the beginning. So here would be a rule, for instance, that would not adhere to this. So S sub 0, S or lambda. So we could remove the need for lambda by just kind of filtering it out like that. S is now the new start to the grammar, so we just filter out that lambda and bubble it up all the way into a new rule. So the substitution rule can produce something of the form of some terminal, some non-terminal, some other terminal. If we do this, then we can write new rules for each possible replacement non-term, if there's an or there. So as an example, here we have a grammar where we have this B in the right-hand side of the A production. So now, rather than having this production, we can completely remove this non-terminal by saying, let's replace this with that. Add an or, replace this with that. So we can turn this into a 4-rule production rather than a 3-rule with another non-terminal and another. So we would end up with something like this. Note that now we can't get to B. There's no B in the A, so this becomes a useless non-terminal. These are useless productions, we can now remove them. There will be a procedure that we will use in the next, coming up next, for figuring out how exactly we're going to do this. We're going to algorithmatize, another word that I like that doesn't actually exist, but it should. We should algorithmatize this, create an algorithm that allows us to actually do this for any given grammar. So how do we do it? We'll start by saying, there's no need to consider any production that is unnecessary. And what do I mean by unnecessary? Let's take a look at this. What do we see when we look at this grammar? Just take a second to look at it and thinking about the title of the slide, unnecessary productions. What do we think about this grammar? Is it unnecessarily complicated?
Place the A, just an AMS.
Would it? If we did lowercase a capital S, that would allow us to, for instance, accept A in the grammar. Is there any way that we could accept A with this grammar? No. So it's a good idea. I would still argue there's unnecessary production here. What's the really big issue? If we choose A, S arrow A, how do we stop? Is there any way to terminate the grammar and accept the string? No. We get caught in this infinite loop of going from A to producing a new A, and then looping back, producing another A, looping back, producing another A, looping back. There's no way to go back and terminate. This is the only terminator. So this grammar is equivalent to one that just doesn't have this A at all, because anytime you would choose it, you don't add any strings to the language. So non-terminal can't terminate and actually produce a sentence. So we can remove the production entirely because it's equivalent by the definition of it produces the same language. And has fewer productions, fewer non-terminals, by any measure it's a similar grammar. To help us with this, we're gonna define this concept of a useful production, which will tell us how to proceed. So a useful production says that this production appears in at least a single derivation to some sentence that's actually in the language. This allows us to define the opposite. A useless production has some useless non-terminal, meaning that we can't get from that non-terminal to any sentence in the language through any sequence of productions. As soon as there is a sequence of productions, that non-terminal has a purpose. It derives that sentence. But if there's no such sentence that can be derived, then it's a useless non-terminal and can be removed. And you can see that it's not always obvious or straightforward. Because this loop has kind of distance 1 here, it could easily be that there is some ridiculously long loop between some number of non-terminals. That means that that entire portion of that grammar is unnecessary if it can't actually derive a sentence. So thinking about this kind of from the bird's eye, we're going to define a production as useless if we can't start from the start state of the grammar and actually derive a terminal string. Great. Let's get some practice. Here is the grammar. Useless productions. Can't terminate, exactly like the last slide, yep. So this is gone. Sorry for the route change, the back camera wasn't working, so I couldn't record.
There's like acid dropping down the road.
Oh no. Oh no, it's raining, right?
Yeah. Like all the way from the mall to Argonne, just filled with it all.
Wow. So we're analyzing useless grammar productions, trying to find ways to consider an equivalent grammar that will define the same language. If we can simplify the grammar in that regard, then that will help us to the next thing we care about. So on the last slide, we looked at a grammar that had a useless production because it loops forever and cannot produce a sentence. And in this case, this is the C, because we get to defining C in terms of itself, which cannot terminate. It can't produce any sentence that's actually in the language defined by this grammar. So because of this, it's perfectly equivalent to just remove this production from the grammar, and it produces the same language. So we define a useless production as one that does not lead to any sentence in the language. It doesn't add anything to the definition of the language. Very similar to a mathematical expression that adds 0 or multiplies by 1. It's just an extra step that doesn't change the end result. This is extra productions that don't change the language. Is that the only useless production in this grammar?
E is also useless.
Right. We define a non-terminal B, but there's no path to reach it. And when we have a non-terminal defined as just a terminal like this, when here it's just defined as that single non-terminal, we can just break up the terminal. So this whole thing is just equivalent to S arrow AS or A. It's kind of ridiculous. So steps involved, which productions can't lead to a terminal string, which productions can't be reached from the start non-terminal. You can think of this kind of like a dependency graph, which looks basically exactly like an automata. So your vertices are your non-terminals, and the edges are directed representing that a production exists that leads you from the non-terminal at the start of the arrow to the non-terminal at the end of the arrow. So we get something like this. So if you drew this out as a directed graph, you would find that if you tried to find all of the vertices that you could get to from the start vertex, you would find that you cannot get to B, which would let you use a graph traversal algorithm if you could basically read this in as a graph. I think this is the shortest slide deck we've had so far. All of 5 slides, 4 with content. But it's all kind of the preliminaries of what we're going to be doing in the next slide deck, which is going to be much more complicated and much more important for deriving the parsing problem of a compiler. Questions on anything about removing useless productions, figuring out which productions can't be reached? All right, we're gonna spend a while on this next slide deck because there's a lot here. Okay, I always start these with motivation. So even though we had motivation about 10 minutes ago, we're gonna have another motivation. So each grammar that can recognize some context-free language can be converted into a bunch of other forms. We know this because there are an infinite number of grammars that could represent the same language. Just add a bunch of useless productions and you can see why this is true. Some forms of grammars have been standardized, and this means that if we can manipulate a grammar into a particular form of grammar, then we can directly feed it into existing algorithms or connect it to an algorithm that already exists for answering important questions. So there are 2 important normal forms that we're going to cover. I'm gonna define one and push it to the side, and we're gonna heavily focus in on the other one because it leads to the answer to the parsing problem. So the one we're gonna focus on is called Chomsky normal form. If you don't know too much about Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, look him up. Genius. But he is the inventor of the normal form. If you ever want to know or remember his name, I just do this silly Daddy Shark Chomsky. There's no P, but you would probably be really offended if you learned that that's how I remember his name. But so to get into Chomsky normal form, we'll talk about converting to Chomsky normal form. But as long as the grammar doesn't have lambda anywhere in the grammar, there is an equivalent grammar in what we're going to call CNF. CNF just stands for Chomsky normal form. The basic idea is we're going to restrict the number of terminals and non-terminals in each production. So productions will have to have a particular form, one of 2 possible forms. And what's nice about this process is it's really easy. The fact that this getting any grammar into CNF is this easy is again brilliant. The other form we're going to cover in very little detail is called Rybach normal form. We will actually come back to this very briefly in a later slide deck when we say, hey, this problem is a lot easier if your grammar is in GNF. We're not going to study it in anywhere near as much detail, but this will come back. So it's worth at least defining now so that we can refer back to it when we find that associated problem that I won't get into now. But just like with CNF, as long as there's no lambda in the grammar, there will be an equivalent grammar in GNF. Similarly to CNF, there are restrictions, but rather than the number of terminals and non-terminals, we care about the relative positions of terminals and non-terminals with respect to each other. Because it doesn't have to do with the number of terminals and non-terminals, the conversion is not quite as straightforward. So we're only going to care for now about some of the results that use this normal form as part of their proof. Again, we're not gonna derive those proofs, but if you're curious, those proofs exist and you can go look at them. You will understand why, but we will talk about the results of those proofs. So we're gonna hone in on what is Chomsky normal form. How do we convert from a grammar without lambda into a grammar that adheres to Chomsky normal form? And then we're gonna dive into CYK, which is gonna use a grammar in Chomsky normal form to be able to solve the membership problem in cubic time. Way better than our exponential time from our brute force method. We're gonna learn exactly how to do it. Which is why we're gonna spend a while on the next few slides. So, CNF, really important. There are only two possible forms of productions. The first possible production is non-terminal, arrow, non-terminal, non-terminal. There must be exactly two non-terminals on the right-hand side. So you can read this as one non-terminal leading to two non-terminals. Can't have one, can't have three or more, exactly two. The second legal production type is non-terminal, arrow, single terminal. So just as practice, go ahead and write a grammar with at least 4 productions adhering to CNF, and that doesn't have any useless productions. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't have to have any meaning or be an associated language, just getting practice with what does a grammar in CNF look like. It is a complete grammar, doesn't have any useless productions. I think there's only one way to get exactly 4 productions out of CNF. I would guess that most of you wrote something with 5. Eight, 6. The only way to get 4 would be something like A arrow BC, A arrow CD, and then define that. All right, I guess sorry, S. Let's try it now. S arrow AB, S arrow BA. Like that. Not a particularly exciting grammar, but one that has exactly 4 productions that adhere to Chomsky normal form. Here we have the first form, here we have the second form. But note if we introduce something like BC here, then we need 3 productions to determine what does A represent, B represent, and C represent in order to have a grammar that doesn't have useless productions. So that's how you end up with 5, if you did A, B, and C, D, then you would need 4 more productions to define A, B, C, and D. So that's how you get 6. That's what I was thinking. All right. So how do we take a grammar that is not in CNF and convert it into a grammar that is in CNF? That seems like a more challenging problem. So this algorithm is going to take as input a grammar, of course, without lambda, or productions with the right-hand side as a single non-term. So those are the 2 things that will break this. We can't have A arrow B, but of course, there are ways that we can deal with this. We've discussed before how to remove these 2 concepts from a grammar while keeping it equivalent. Anyone give me a refresher? how do we remove lambda? Make a new overarching production, so you're gonna filter it all the way to the top. Find a way to do that, and then bring it out. So we can do it that way, then with a single non-terminal, we can just replace it. If you have A arrow B, that's kind of useless. Wherever there's an A, just put a B. You can filter that down through the grammar, and then there's no purpose to A. So we can get rid of both of these concepts in any existing grammar with some overarching rules that filter it out. So we're going to start with a new grammar. So instead of modifying the existing grammar, we're going to be producing a new grammar. We're going to start with all productions of the form non-terminal arrow, some number of terminals or non-terminals. You're going to go through them kind of one by one. If the size of the list is 1, it must be a terminal. Then we're going to introduce a sequence of new non-terminals for each terminal in the production. Because we know that CNF, one of those legal rules, is non-terminal arrow terminal. So we're just going to be now creating non-terminals for those terminals and making a bunch of new rules where those non-terminals lead to that terminal. If that makes sense. I think an example will help this, but I want to get the whole process out there so we refer back to this process when we get into the example. So every terminal should always be represented by the same new non-terminal. For each new non-terminal we introduce, we're going to add a new production, as I just talked about. The non-terminal arrow, a terminal that converts each of the non-terminals into their final terminal representation. After you do this, there are no terminals in any production that is more than 1. Do we agree with that statement? Does that make sense? After we've replaced every terminal in the grammar with a non-terminal and then added a bunch of productions that convert that new non-terminal we just added into the terminal, then the productions are all non-terminal arrow, some number of non-terminals, or non-terminal arrow terminal. We have it in those two forms, then we can start chopping up all of the productions that are non-terminal arrow some list of non-terminals. We're going to introduce new non-terminals for each pair of those that reduce the length of each long production of non-terminals by 1. Until we have a long sequence of non-terminal arrow, non-terminal productions. So each production is currently of this form, non-terminal arrow, a bunch of non-terminals from 1 up to L. To get this smaller, we're going to do a replacement. So the number of non-terminals on the right-hand side, we're going to call that L. We'll introduce a bunch of new non-terminals, exactly L minus 2 of them, that represent pieces of this. So we're going to say that we have the production N, this original N, arrow N1, C1, where C1 represents the rest of this list. We will then define C1 to be N2, C2, which represents the rest of this list. We're going to define C2 to be N3, C3, where C3 is the rest of this list, until we have CL minus 2, that is the last 2 non-terminals. And you see that now we have a sequence of non-terminal arrow 2 non-terminals. non-terminal arrow, two non-terminals. And this will be equivalent to that. How are we doing with that concept before we move forward? Does that make sense? Hoping I explained that okay. And then you're just gonna, if you're replacing, then remove all the old productions that aren't in CNF. If you were just adding to a new one, then you're done. The resulting grammar is in CNF. Every production adheres to one of those two legal forms. So this process isn't too bad. Let's give you an example. Let's convert this grammar into CNF. So what was that first step? What should we do? Yeah, so we're gonna make new non-terminals for each of the terminals. So we're going to start with, how do we wanna do this? What did I do? I think I used, regardless of what I use for the rest of this, I'm going to make a new set of non-terminals called capital T A that is going to represent A. This is like the, I guess maybe we want N, maybe we should use N. Non-terminal for A gets us to A. Non-terminal for B gets us to B. And non-terminal to C gets us to C. I think that, hopefully that form makes sense as to what we're doing here. We're just introducing 3 new non-terminals that directly map to the terminals. So now we could directly replace these into these existing strings. So we could now write this as this new arrow is not A, B, A. We have A followed by B, which is N, B, A, which is N, A. So now we have 3 non-terminals in this production. Here we have N, A, N, A, N, B. Here we have A and C. Are any of these already in CNF? Yeah, this last one, B arrow A and C. So we could just add that over here. We're gonna say, as another production, B arrow A and C needs no further work. But now, we need to split these guys up, because neither of them adhere to CNF. And we need to represent and make new non-terminals that represent sequences of this. So here's where I learned if that last section of that last slide made sense. How would we do that? Just focusing on this first. First of all, how many productions should we get out of this production? How many productions is it gonna take to convert this into CNF? 2, that's right. So we first need to take this first part, and then we're gonna make a variable out of the second part. We're gonna make a non-terminal that represents both of these. So we're going to add S arrow A followed by whatever this variable is going to be that represents this. I'm gonna call this S sub 1. Because it's a breakdown of some piece of S. We then need to define what S sub 1 is, but luckily the size of S sub 1 is now 2, which we can represent in CNF. So S sub 1 is N sub B, N sub A. That's in CNF. Now, if we take these two rules combined, they're logically equivalent to this rule. Now we just need to do the same thing to this production. So we're going to make a production that says A arrow, the first non-terminal n sub A, and then we're going to variabilize everything that remains. And we're going to say this now gets replaced by a new variable name. Because we're working on the production A, I'm going to use A sub 1 to represent that. So the second part of this is A sub 1. We're now going to define A sub 1 as the components of this. N sub A, N sub B. There we have it. A grammar in CNF that is logically equivalent represents exactly the same language as this grammar. But all productions are in one of those two forms, non-terminal arrow terminal or non-terminal arrow non-terminal non-terminal. If this were longer than 3, we would need to kind of chain this rule together. Right, does that make sense? If there was an n sub c here, for instance, s sub 1 would need to be all of this, and then we would need an s sub 2 for all of this. And you see that you're kind of shrinking the size of this variable, the number of non-terminals that are in it by 1 each time you successfully do a replacement. Which is why if we go back in general, we get this rule down here. How many of them are there going to be? They're going to be the number of productions minus 2 extra productions. So there were 3 non-terminals here to start, so there are going to be 2 rules. The number of new non-terminals added is going to be this number minus 1. We needed 1 new non-terminal for this. So that's why we get length of it minus 2 new non-terminals. That should be what I derived, but using hopefully better variables. I pulled these directly out of the book, and whenever I pull something directly out of the book, I try to simplify it whenever I can. Because math books tend to be a little bit more obfuscated. But there are 5 rules there, the non-terminal, non-terminal. There are 5 rules here, non-terminal to non-terminal. So whichever of these terminologies makes more sense for helping you to go through the process, you can borrow that. Questions on this process?
Doing it, you've already defined, I guess, variable or whatever, you can reuse it like if
Yeah.
A, it's MB and then MA.
Yeah,
You could just reuse
yeah, exactly. If you had another one that was exactly the same, like for instance, if this was n sub b rather than n sub c, and we were to do that, then we could reuse what we do here there to reduce the number of non-terminals. Absolutely. Other questions? It's a really good question. There's multiple better erasers over there, but I hate myself this one. I'm going to use this. Okay. Let's give you an intro to GNF, where we're not going to worry about these details. I'm going to give them to you, but there won't be any open problems asking you to convert something into GNF. There will be for CNF, but I will not ask you to convert it to GNF because it is significantly harder. So let's talk about the rules for GNF, just so that you know them. If we have, we have a single non-terminal on the left-hand side, we have a single terminal followed by 0 or more non-terminals on the right-hand side. That is the only rule for GNF. It's really simple to define, but that makes it a little bit harder to convert to. So go ahead and just give yourself a little bit of fun, try to come up with a grammar of four or more productions that adheres to GNF. And again, make sure there are no useless productions. Something like this would work. What language does this represent? It's a really boring thing. How many strings are in this language? Just one. This literally represents the string, what is it, A, B, C, D? Really boring, but hey, it's in right on normal form. But maybe you can start to see some of the use of this, because now, kind of like a regular grammar, there's a nice easy way to parse this into the string in linear time. So this becomes one of the ways that you can parse something. We're not studying this anywhere near as much depth. Sorry, classes this morning because of a camera issue.
Okay.
So, do we want to go into the 1 minute left? So the member, I need to define the membership problem. So is the query string in the language defined by the grammar? Great. Can we see or think about, maybe this is where we leave things, why is this question significantly easier if the grammar is in CNF? Trying to get some kind of intuition as to why converting into CNF would make this problem easier. So this is now not GNF, but CNF. The two rules, single terminal or two straight non-terminals. I will leave that to you to ponder for the next day. I have office hours starting in my office. I know that I assigned you a very difficult homework. And this is not a competition to see how long we can wait until the first person comes to see me in office hours. If it were a competition, you all would be doing great or terribly, depending on how we're looking at this. I have tons of availability. I would love to answer any questions, help you make this more intuitive. So feel free to come see me. Let's walk through some of these proofs together. If you have time and questions. See you tomorrow.